Four famous musicians in tailored suits stood outside a dilapidated apartment in Montana. When the door slowly opened, an old janitor appeared, still clutching the cheap sandwich he'd bought for lunch. One of the musicians stepped forward and quietly asked, "Do you remember us? November 1983. You were the only one who stopped." The old man froze. In an instant, 25 years of memories came rushing back. On the worst night of his life, he had helped four desperate strangers, then spent decades believing that small act of kindness had meant nothing. But now, 25 years later, those same strangers were standing at his door, ready to repay that kindness in a way that would change his life forever. This is a story we created, but the kindness, the choices, and the moments within it reflect something very real about life. Welcome to Memory Stories. The garage had been his whole life for 23 years, and now Walter Hayes was locking it up for the last time. November of 1983, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and stays there, the kind that reminds you how small you are against the world. Harlow Creek, Nebraska. Population 1,200, give or take a few dozen, depending on who had moved away that season and who hadn't quite gotten around to leaving yet. A two-lane highway running east through cornfields that had gone gray and brittle in the autumn frost. A water tower with the town's name painted in letters that were already starting to peel. A diner, a hardware store, a church with a leaning steeple, and until 2 days ago, when the bank had come to collect what was owed, a repair shop called Hayes Auto that had kept half the vehicles in 3 counties, running for over 2 decades. Walter was 46 years old. He had the hands of a man who had spent his life working with them, thick-knuckled, permanently stained at the edges, with grease that no amount of soap could fully undo. He was not a tall man, but he was solid, the kind of solid that comes from honest work rather than a gym, and his face had the weathered, settled quality of someone who had made peace with hard things, or at least gotten used to them. His hair had gone more gray than black somewhere around his 43rd birthday, and he had stopped being surprised by things years ago, or so he thought. The bank had foreclosed 2 days earlier. 23 years of running Hayes Auto in Harlow Creek, and it had all come apart over the past 3 years, in a way that felt both sudden and inevitable, the way a crack in a foundation looks harmless until the whole wall gives. None of it had come easy, not even the beginning. When Walt had first tried to get a business loan in 1960 to open the garage, the bank in Harlow Creek had turned him down flat without explanation, which needed no explanation for a black man trying to borrow money in a small Nebraska town in 1960. His older brother Roy had co-signed a second application at a bank in Omaha, and that had been the only reason Hayes Auto had ever existed at all. Walt had spent the first 5 years proving to a town that hadn't expected him to last that he was the best mechanic within 40 miles. And eventually, the town had come around the way towns sometimes do when a man's work is simply too good to argue with. He had earned every customer, every referral, every handshake. Nothing had been given. All of it had been built. The divorce from his wife Patricia had drained him financially and emotionally in ways he had not anticipated and could not have prepared for. Patricia had taken their daughter Ellie to California when Ellie was 12 years old, moving in with Patricia's sister in Sacramento, and telling Ellie things about Walt that Ellie had believed because she was 12 and her mother was all she had out there. The legal fees from the custody battle, the back and forth with lawyers. Walt couldn't afford the loans he had taken out to keep the garage afloat during the slow years. All of it had stacked up until the structure couldn't hold anymore. He was leaving in the morning. Roy had a construction job waiting for him up in Bozeman, Montana. Manual labor, framing houses, starting over with nothing but the tools in his truck, and whatever was left of his willingness to keep going. Walt had packed most of his belongings that afternoon. The personal things, the photographs, the few items that mattered. The garage tools were staying because they belonged to the bank now, along with everything else. He had kept only his personal hand tools, the ones a man buys himself over years of work, the ones that fit his grip. In a way, borrowed tools never quite do. He was carrying the last box to his truck when he heard it. A guitar, muffled, distant, coming from somewhere down the highway in the direction of the interstate. A few bars of something raw and searching, then silence. Then a few more bars, halting like someone picking out a melody to pass the time. Rather than performing it, the sound of a person playing, not for an audience, but for themselves, playing. because sitting still, in the cold and the dark without music was worse than the alternative. Walt set the box down. He stood in the doorway of the garage and listened to the cold night. Temperature had dropped hard after sunset. Snow had started falling about an hour ago, not heavy yet, just that first tentative dusting that coats everything in thin white and makes the world look clean in a way it never actually is. The two-lane highway running through the eastern edge of Harlow Creek was empty in both directions except for a van pulled over on the shoulder, about half a mile out, its hazard lights blinking orange in the dark, patient and steady, the visual equivalent of asking for help without quite knowing how. He watched the hazard lights for a long moment, keys in his hand, truck packed, nothing left here that was his anymore. Not your problem, he thought. You're leaving in 6 hours. You've got nothing left to give these people. You gave this town 23 years, and it took everything you had, and now you're done. Let somebody else stop. But the guitar sound pulled something up from a place he had buried deep. He had not thought about that feeling in a long time, had trained himself not to think about it. But it came back to him now, with the specificity of something deeply buried, the sensation of playing guitar in a cold garage at 23 years old, playing because the dream was slipping away, and the music was the only way to express the thing you couldn't say out loud. He had made that same sound 23 years ago, not just the notes, but the feeling underneath them. Someone playing to hold on to something that was already leaving. Walt had been a musician once, a genuine one, not just weekend campfire strumming, but a real musician with a real band and a real shot at something. He and 3 other young black men from Omaha had played together for 4 years in the late 1950s and early 60s, a soul and R&B outfit that could do things with harmony, that made people stop mid-conversation in whatever bar or church hall they were playing. They had gotten tight, and they had gotten good, and they had recorded a demo and gotten it into the hands of a producer in Chicago who worked with one of the smaller imprints connected to a major label. The man had called them back, had wanted to meet them, for a black band from Nebraska in 1960. That kind of call did not come twice, and everybody in the group knew it. Walt had been 23 years old, and the world had been about to open up, or as much of it as was willing to open for a young black musician in 1960, which was narrower than it should have been, but real enough to be worth running toward with everything you had. Then, Patricia had told him she was pregnant. Walt had done what he believed was the right thing. He had married her. He had stayed. He had opened the garage with money Roy had helped him secure, and he had told himself that providing for his family was its own kind of music, its own kind of meaning, and maybe it had been. He didn't regret Ellie. He had never once, not for a single day, regretted Ellie. But he had regretted not going to Chicago, and that regret had never fully quieted, just settled into something he carried. The way you carry an old injury, always there, usually ignorable, occasionally sharp enough to take your breath. Those people in that van were probably going to their Chicago. One last good thing, Walt thought. Then I'll go. He grabbed his toolbox from the back of the truck and drove out to the van. 4 young men stood around the open hood in the cold, their breath making clouds in the November air. Early 20s, all of them white kids from the look of them, that unmistakable combination of confidence and desperation that belongs specifically to people who have bet everything on a dream and are watching the odds shift against them. Long hair, denim jackets, the smell of cigarettes and fast food, and too many miles in a small space. One of them was sitting on the rear bumper, holding an acoustic guitar across his knees. Not really playing now, just resting his hands on the strings, the way you hold something you are afraid of losing. Walt pulled up and got out. The one closest to the hood looked up startled, first by the headlights, then visibly relieved the way people look when they have been standing in the dark, long enough that the sight of any other human being feels like rescue regardless of anything else. You boys broken down, yeah. Engine just quit on us about an hour ago. You're the first person who stopped. Walt moved to the hood and looked at the engine with his flashlight. Old Dodge van, probably a 75 or 76. The engine had the appearance of something that had been held together through optimism and improvised repairs for far longer than was technically reasonable. Did you try calling a tow? No money for a tow, the guitar player said. We've got $32 between the 4 of us. Walt examined the engine carefully, moving the flashlight from point to point, reading the machine the way he had read machines for 23 years. Fuel pump's gone. You've also got a radiator leak that's been getting worse for a while by the look of it. You're not driving this anywhere tonight. The guitar player's face changed, in a way that Walt recognized the specific expression of a man watching his last option close. We have to be in Chicago by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We have a meeting. We absolutely have to be there. Something in the way he said it. Not a want, not a hope. Half to the kind that comes from understanding. There is no alternative. What kind of meeting? Walt asked. The drummer, a stocky young man with a red beard, answered before the guitar player could. A&R director at Atlantic Records. He heard our demo tape 6 weeks ago. Reached out, asked us to come in. This is the only response we've gotten from anyone in 2 years of sending out tapes to every label in the country. Walt did the math, without meaning to. It was just past midnight. Chicago was approximately 280 miles east. Even if he could somehow fix this van tonight, which he couldn't without parts, they would need to leave by 2 in the morning, at the absolute latest, to make an 8 o'clock meeting with any margin for winter driving conditions. The auto supply in Waverly, 30 miles west, didn't open until 7 in the morning. Where are you coming from? Walt asked. Portland, the guitar player said. We've been touring for 3 years, playing whatever we could get, bars, clubs, festivals, anywhere that would have us. We recorded a demo 8 months ago. Spent money we didn't have on studio time. Borrowed it from people who aren't patient about being paid back. He paused. If we miss this meeting, we go home broke and in debt to people who don't accept excuses. The bassist, a lean young man with wire-rimmed glasses, spoke quietly. This is it for us, sir. This meeting is everything we have left. Walt looked at the four of them for a long moment. He looked at the guitar on the bumper, and at the van that had carried them from Portland, and at the highway stretching east toward the city, where their future was either going to happen or not happen. He looked at the way the snow was falling on their jackets, and how none of them were complaining about the cold, because the cold was not the problem. He saw something in their faces that had nothing to do with the color of anyone's skin, and everything to do with the specific, desperate hope of young people who have given everything to a dream and are one broken fuel pump away from losing it. He saw himself at 23, standing in a different garage, holding a different kind of dream, trying to decide if the responsible choice and the right choice were actually the same thing. Let me make a call, Walt said. Walt towed the van back to Hayes Auto on the dolly he kept for roadside pickups, a piece of equipment that technically belonged to the bank, now along with the rest of the property, but that the bank did not know about yet, and that Walt had decided he would use one final time for one final purpose. He pulled the van into the bay, turned on the shop lights, and started assessing the damage properly, while the four band members stood in the warmth of the garage and tried not to look as terrified as they were. The guitar player introduced himself while Walt worked. Danny Hartwell from Portland, Oregon. The drummer was Cooper Webb. The bassist was Tommy Ames. The rhythm guitarist was a quiet young man named Garrett Reeves, who said almost nothing from the moment they arrived, but who watched everything with dark, serious eyes, absorbing the situation the way quiet people absorb things completely and without commentary. Walt noticed early on that Garrett's gaze kept returning to the old acoustic guitar hanging on the garage wall, the one Walt hadn't touched in 23 years, and the way Garrett looked at it suggested he understood something about what it meant for a guitar to hang unused on a wall for a very long time. Walt told them his name, and that was about all he said for the first hour, because he was running calculations in his head, working through the problem, the way he had always worked through problems methodically, without panic, accepting the constraints and looking for the path within them. The fuel pump would need to be sourced from the auto supply in Waverly, 30 miles west, which opened at 7 in the morning. Installation would take approximately 90 minutes, assuming no complications. Realistically, the van would not be road ready before 9:30 in the morning at the earliest. Chicago was 280 miles away, and the roads were getting worse with snow. They would arrive around 4:30 in the afternoon, 8.5 hours after their meeting was supposed to begin. Danny sat down on the concrete floor of the garage with his guitar across his lap, not playing, just holding it. We're not going to make it in the van, are we? It wasn't a question. No, Walt confirmed. Not in the van. Can we rent a car somewhere nearby? Nearest rental place is 45 miles west in Waverly. And you have $32. Danny put his head back against the workbench and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. 3 years. We gave 3 years to this. Left jobs, left relationships, left everything we had. Put in 10, 12 hours a day writing and rehearsing and recording and driving and sending out tapes to people who mostly never wrote back. And we're going to miss the one meeting that mattered because of a fuel pump. Walt straightened up from the engine and looked at this young man, 23 years old. The same age Walt had been when he had put down the guitar and told himself it was the responsible thing. The same look in his eyes that Walt had seen in his own mirror for 2 decades. The look of someone who had run out of options and was trying to figure out how to accept it. Then Walt said, "I have a brother." Danny looked up. Roy lives in Rochester, Minnesota. He's a contractor, drives through the Chicago area regularly for job sites. If I call him right now, he might be able to pick you up and have you in Chicago by 7:30 in the morning. The 4 young men looked at each other. Tommy spoke carefully. "Why would you do that for us? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." Walt looked at the old acoustic guitar hanging on the garage wall. He had hung it there when he opened Hayes Auto in 1960, telling himself he might play it again someday. He had left it there for 23 years. As a reminder, though what exactly it reminded him of changed depending on the day. Tonight, looking at it in the cold light of a garage that wouldn't be his by morning, it reminded him of both the choice he had made and the choice he had not made, and of the distance between those two things that he had been carrying ever since. Because 23 years ago, I had a shot at Chicago too, Walt said. A producer heard our demo tape, wanted to meet us. We were a soul and R&B group out of Omaha, 4 black men who could really play, and somebody in Chicago was finally ready to listen. And I didn't go because life had other plans, and I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. He paused. I have spent every single day since then wondering what would have happened if I had just gone. You boys are going to your Chicago. I'm not going to let a fuel pump stop you if there's anything I can do about it. Cooper, the drummer, looked at Walt for a long moment with the expression of someone recalibrating what they had assumed about the world. That's the most decent thing anybody's said to us in 3 years of touring. Walt picked up the phone on the garage wall. Roy answered on the 4th ring, groggy and annoyed, and completely unprepared for what his younger brother was asking him at 12:30 in the morning. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Roy complained steadily throughout. He had a job site in Indianapolis to reach by Tuesday. He hadn't planned on stops. It was the middle of the night and Walt was out of his mind. I know it's crazy, Walt said. Do it anyway. Roy was quiet on the line for a moment. Then he said, Fine. I'll be there by 5 in the morning. Walt hung up and told the 4 young men to find somewhere to sleep in the garage for the next few hours. There were old moving blankets in the storage room. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry and considerably better than a broken-down van on the shoulder of a Nebraska highway in November. Cooper and Tommy found spots quickly, exhaustion overcoming everything else within minutes. Garrett settled into a corner near the workbench and was asleep almost immediately. Danny stayed up. He sat against the workbench while Walt worked on the van, prepping everything he could so the morning repair would go as fast as possible. They talked. Walt didn't usually talk while he worked, but something about this particular night made conversation feel natural. Maybe the cold outside and the warmth of the garage lights and the radio on the workbench, playing an R&B station out of Omaha. Maybe the simple fact that it was the last night he would ever spend in this building, and some part of him wasn't ready to spend it in silence. Danny asked about the music, about what it had been like, about why Walt had really given it up, and whether he ever thought about picking it up again. Walt told him more than he had told anyone in 23 years, because Danny listened the way musicians listen, not for the story, but for the feeling underneath the story. I used to play soul and R&B. Walt said, not looking up from the engine. Real harmony stuff, 4-part. My bandmates could do things with their voices that made grown men stop mid-sentence in whatever bar we were playing. We had something real. I knew we had something real even then. What happened to the others, the rest of your band? Last I heard, our lead singer ended up doing session work in Kansas City. The other 2 went back to their families. Same thing I did. Walt paused for a long moment. Music has a way of waiting for you, he said finally. The songs don't go anywhere. But the courage to stand up and play them, that one gets harder every year you wait. The older you get, the more you've got to lose. Or the more you think you do. You could still play, Danny said quietly. It's not too late. Walt shook his head without looking up. Maybe the notes, not the courage. But you've still got both. So don't waste them. Don't let anything make you put it down. Danny didn't say anything for a while after that. But Walt noticed he held the guitar a little differently for the rest of the night, the way you hold something after someone has reminded you what it is worth. Roy's truck pulled into the lot at 5 in the morning, headlights cutting through the snow that had been falling steadily for hours. The four young men loaded their equipment into the cab and the truck bed with the efficiency of people who have been loading and unloading gear into vehicles for years, every movement practiced and fast. Danny was the last one to climb in. He stood at the truck door and looked back at Walt, who was standing in the garage doorway with a cup of coffee that had gone cold sometime around 3 in the morning. "How do I pay you back?" Danny asked. "You go in there and you nail that meeting," Walt said. "That's all." Danny nodded slowly. Then he said, "What was your band called, the one that almost made it to Chicago?" Walt smiled. "The Omaha Four? Not very original." "I'll remember that," Danny said. "And I'll remember your name." Walt watched Roy's truck pull out of the lot and disappear down the highway toward the interstate, the taillights shrinking in the falling snow until there was nothing left to look at. He stood in the doorway until the cold became more than he wanted to stand in, then went back inside and finished prepping for the morning repair. He did not let himself think too hard about whether he would ever hear from them again. Walt worked until noon. He sourced the fuel pump from Waverly at 7 in the morning, drove there, and back in his truck, then installed it properly, along with a thorough radiator repair, an oil change, a belt replacement, and a comprehensive inspection of every system in the van he could reach. He did not do this quickly or carelessly. He did it the way he had done every repair in 23 years of running Hayes Auto with attention and thoroughness, and the understanding that someone's safety depended on the work being done correctly. These four young men were going to drive from Chicago back to Portland when this was over, and he wanted them to get there safely. By the time he finished, the bank's representative was parked outside, waiting to do the walkthrough. Walt wiped his hands, signed what needed to be signed, handed over the keys to Hayes Auto for the last time, and loaded his truck. He was on the interstate heading northwest toward Montana when Roy reached him on the CB radio. Roy had driven the band to the front entrance of the Atlantic Records building in Chicago at 7:47 in the morning. They had been 13 minutes early. Walt pressed the transmit button and said, "Thanks, Roy." "You are completely out of your mind," Roy said, with the particular affection of an older brother who has been saying this for decades and means it as the highest form of compliment. Walt drove to Bozeman and started over. He worked construction with Roy's crew for 7 years, doing the kind of physical work that keeps a man from thinking too much, which was mostly what he needed in those years. Then he moved to Casper, Wyoming, for a decade of similar work with a different company. Then, in his early 60s, he settled in a one-room apartment in Billings, Montana, and took a job as a night janitor at a community college. He mopped floors from 10 at night until 6 in the morning and slept until 2 in the afternoon, and spent the hours between waking and work reading paperback westerns and watching the evening news and eating meals he assembled from the grocery store rather than cooked. He was not unhappy exactly. He had settled into the kind of life that occupies the territory between satisfaction and resignation, something functional that did not shine. He kept to himself. He had never remarried, had never even dated seriously, had told himself over the years that he was built for solitude and that solitude suited him fine. His daughter Ellie had stayed in California with Patricia. He had tried to reach her in the years after the divorce, sending letters to addresses that turned out to be old calling numbers that had been disconnected, hiring a lawyer in 1987 who had done his best and produced nothing. Patricia had been thorough. She had moved, twice, changed her phone number, and told Ellie things that were not fully true, enough of them crafted carefully enough to make Ellie believe, at 12, and then 15, and then 18, that her father had chosen a new life, deliberately without them in it. By the time the lawyer told Walt there was nothing more that could be done without court involvement that would cost more than he could possibly afford, Ellie was 18, an adult, and there was no legal mechanism to require contact with a grown woman who had been told her father had moved on. Walt told himself she was better off without the disruption. He told himself a lot of things over the years the way you do when the alternative is sitting with an unbearable truth. The cassette tape from that November night in 1983 sat in a shoebox under his bed. He had listened to it exactly once, the evening after the band drove away in Roy's truck, sitting alone in the empty garage before the bank representative arrived, playing it on the old cassette deck on the workbench. The sound of it had opened something in him that he had not been ready to have, opened the rawness of the music, the hunger in it, the reminder of everything he had set aside and everything he had given away to people who had stopped giving back. He had put the tape in the shoebox and put the shoebox under the bed because he was not strong enough to keep listening and not willing to throw it away. He kept it through every move, every apartment, every fresh start, because it was the one piece of evidence he had that one night he had done something that mattered. He did not seek out the band's music deliberately after that, but he heard them anyway, the way you hear things when they are everywhere. The radio in the construction truck in Bozeman, the television in the break room at the community college in Billings. He heard Danny's voice coming out of speakers in enough different contexts, over enough years, that the sound of it became simply part of the background of the world, familiar and distant, the way a landmark is familiar when you pass it regularly without stopping. He knew who they had become. He knew what the meeting in Chicago had produced. He thought about those 4 young men, sometimes thought about the snow, and the hazard lights and the cold garage, and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite sorrow, but lived in the neighborhood of both. He never told anyone. What would he have said? He was a black janitor, mopping floors at a community college in Montana. The story would have sounded like something a lonely man invents to make his life feel significant. And even if someone had believed him, what would it have changed? He still mopped floors. He still went home to a one-room apartment. He still had a daughter somewhere in California who he could not reach. He never tried to contact the band through their management or their label, though he knew their names and knew that such a thing was theoretically possible. The thought occurred to him sometimes late at night, after his shift, in the way thoughts occur when you are tired and your defenses are down. He always talked himself out of it before morning. They had met thousands of people since that night. They had played in cities all over the world. They had no reason to remember one mechanic in Nebraska on one cold night in 1983, and Walt was not interested in finding out that was true by asking. He kept mopping floors. He kept the cassette tape in its shoebox. Before we go any further, just stop for a second and think about what Walter just did. He's losing his garage. He's leaving town in 6 hours. He has nothing left to give, and yet he picked up that phone. He called his brother in the middle of the night for 4 strangers he met an hour ago. No payment, no guarantee, just the simple belief that these kids deserve their shot. If that kind of kindness still moves you, if you believe the world needs more people who stop when everyone else keeps driving, take a moment right now to like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We have people watching from all across this country, and every single comment reminds us that stories like Walt's still matter. We'll be right back with what happens next. It was a Tuesday morning in late October of 2008 when someone knocked on Walter Hayes' apartment door at 11:30 in the morning. Walt was not a man who received visitors. His neighbors knew him by face and by the polite nod he offered in the hallway, but not much more. His landlord communicated by note. Roy called on the phone every few weeks. There was nobody in Walter Hayes' life who showed up at his door unannounced, so when the knock came, he assumed it was a neighbor with a noise complaint or the building manager with a maintenance issue, and he opened the door with the kind of mild, neutral expression a person uses for ordinary interruptions. 4 men stood in the hallway. They were in their late 40s, all of them well-dressed in the careful, understated way of people who have money but grew up without it, and still carry a slight self-consciousness about the fact. Good coats, good shoes, worn with a quality of almost naturalness, like something that fits very well, but is not yet entirely forgotten as something being worn. They were grayer than they had been. One of them had filled out considerably since 1983, but the dark hair going silver at the temples, and the thin, sharp face and the eyes, Walt would have known those eyes anywhere. the eyes of someone who had been tired for a long time and had decided a very long time ago not to stop anyway. Walter Hayes, the one in front, said, "Yeah. Do you remember us November of 1983? Nebraska. You fixed our van." Walt's hand tightened on the doorframe. The man's face broke into a smile that had 25 years of complicated, relieved, grateful emotion behind it. "Danny Hartwell, and this is Cooper, Tommy, and Garrett." Walt could not speak. His brain was doing what brains do. When they receive information, they have categorically decided will never arrive, rejecting it first, trying to find an alternate explanation, then slowly, very slowly, beginning to accept. His hands started shaking, not from weakness, but from something he had no name for, the physical sensation of a thing you have written off as gone forever, appearing in your hallway on a Tuesday morning in October. "Can we come in?" Danny asked. Walt stepped back from the door. The four of them moved into his apartment, which was one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, the entire space, smaller than the lobby, of any building these men likely walked through on a regular basis. They sat on his couch and on the floor, and Walt stood because he could not make himself sit, could not make his body accept that this was a situation in which sitting was appropriate. "How did you find me?" Walt finally managed. Danny looked at Cooper. Cooper looked at Tommy. There was something in the way they exchanged that glance, the look of a story told many times, that still carried the same weight each time. "We went back to Harlow Creek in the summer of 1990, Danny said. "Wanted to find you. Wanted to pay you back properly. Thank you in person. The garage was already gone. Torn down. Nobody in town could tell us more than that. You'd packed up and left sometime in '84. Roy mentioned Montana," Cooper added. "Your brother. We found him through a mutual contact years later. He said you'd been in Bozeman, but that you moved around a lot and he didn't have a current address. We've been looking for you since 1990, Danny said. On and off, at first more seriously, as we got the resources to hire people who knew how to find people. We had 3 different private investigators working on it at various points. We found you 4 months ago through employment records and a Social Security match. It took 2 years of serious searching across Montana and Wyoming to get here." Walt finally sat down slowly on the edge of his bed. "Why," he said, not ungratefully, genuinely, "you're famous. You've been famous for 20 years. I fixed your van. I made one phone call to my brother." Danny looked at him steadily for a moment before answering. "Walt, do you know what time we walked into that meeting at Atlantic Records?" "Roy radioed me on the CB," Walt said. 7:47. The meeting was at 8 o'clock. The A&R director, a man named Paul Sheridan, was known throughout the industry for one thing above everything else. He did not wait. If you were not in the room at the appointed time, the meeting ended, and it did not get rescheduled. His assistant confirmed this for us years later. If we had walked in at 8:01, we would have been turned away. There would not have been another chance. Paul Sheridan did not give second appointments to people who missed the first one. Danny leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "We walked in at 7:47 because you fixed our van and called your brother at midnight on the night you were losing everything you had. Walt, we signed a development deal that morning. We spent 2 years writing the album. It went platinum on its first release. We toured arenas. We've sold 38 million records. We've played on every continent. We have done things none of us could have dreamed of, standing on that highway in the snow. And not one single record, not one single show, not one single moment of any of it exists if you don't stop that night." The room was quiet. Tommy spoke. "Walt, we wrote a song about you. Second album, first single. We called it Somebody Stopped. It went to #1. And we have played it at every single concert we have done for 22 years. Every show without exception. And every show Danny tells the story before we play it." Danny pulled out his phone, found a video and handed it across to Walt. Concert footage. A stadium vast and full, the kind that holds 20,000 people and makes them feel intimate anyway, because the music is doing what good music does. Danny, on stage, older than the young man on the highway, but unmistakably himself, speaking into the microphone while 20,000 people waited. This next song is about a man named Walter Hayes. "In November of 1983, our van broke down on a highway in Nebraska. It was past midnight. It was snowing. We were 4 broke kids with $32 between us, and the most important meeting of our lives 8 hours away. This man stopped. He fixed our van. He called his brother to drive us. He refused to take a single dollar from us. We have been trying to find him for 25 years. Walt, if you're out there, this one has always been for you." Then the band began to play. Walt had heard this song on the radio. He had heard it dozens of times across 2 decades on the radio, in construction trucks in the break room, at the community college, coming through the speakers of a bar television in Casper, on a night he had stopped in for a cup of coffee on the way home from a job site. He had heard it without knowing. He had listened to a song about himself without knowing. It was about himself, had felt something move in him. When he heard it, without being able to name what that something was, he was crying before the first verse finished. He was a 71-year-old black man sitting on the edge of his bed, in a one-room apartment in Billings, Montana, crying because 4 men he had helped on a cold night 25 years ago had spent those 25 years singing his name at every show, searching for him across 3 states, tracking him through employment records and private investigators and decades of moving around, and it turned out he had been right here the whole time, mopping floors and eating grocery store sandwiches, and thinking that the good he had done had dissolved into the nothing that kindness dissolves into when the world moves on. "We tried to find you," Danny said quietly, when he stopped the video. "We really did. We wanted you at the first show, at every show after that. I moved around a lot, following work. We know. That's how hard you were to find." "I didn't think I mattered," Walt said. "That night was a long time ago. I figured you boys forgot about it inside of a year. When everything was going well, and you had the whole world in front of you, why would you think about one mechanic in Nebraska?" Danny shook his head slowly. "Not for a single day." He said it simply, without performance or emphasis. "The way you say something that is just true, and has always been true, and will continue to be true, regardless of whether anyone believes it." The envelope Danny handed Walt was sealed, cream-colored, the kind of envelope that contains something significant. Walt opened it and looked at the check inside. He read the number. He read it again. He looked up at Danny. "That covers the cost of the repair and the tow plus interest calculated from November 1983 to today," Danny said. "Plus, what we consider a fair royalty for the fact that the song we wrote about you has been our highest charting single for 22 years and has been performed at every concert we have ever given. You are, whether you feel comfortable with it or not, partially responsible for a #1 record." Walt tried to hand it back. "No," Danny said firmly and without apology. "That's not something you get to do. This is not charity. It is payment for a service rendered and a debt we have owed for 25 years. You invested in us that night. You invested your time, your parts, your brother's sleep, your last night in a garage that was no longer yours. This is your return on that investment." "I didn't do it to get paid," Walt said. "We know," Tommy said. "That's exactly why we're paying you." Garrett spoke then. It was the first full sentence he had delivered since arriving, quiet and direct, the way quiet people say important things without preamble or hedging. "Walt, the night you stopped for us, you weren't just fixing a van. You were deciding what kind of man you were going to be on the worst night of your life. That kind of decision has consequences for a lot of people across a lot of years. It's right that you know about those consequences." Walt held the check and said nothing for a long moment. He looked at Garrett and thought about the quiet young man in the corner of his garage all those years ago, the serious eyes that had watched everything and said almost nothing, the gaze that had kept returning to the old guitar on the wall. He thought about how Garrett had understood something that night, without being told, had seen something in that dusty guitar hanging on the wall that the others hadn't looked for. "There's something else," Danny said. "The music school." The band had founded a non-profit music school in Los Angeles 4 years earlier. It served 300 students a year from families who could not afford private instruction, kids whose public schools had cut their arts programs, who had the desire and the talent and no access to anyone who could help them develop either. The school needed instructors, and not just technically competent ones. It needed people who understood what music costs personally, what it means to want it when the world gives you reasons not to pursue it, what it feels like to set it down, and what it costs to pick it back up. Full salary, full benefits, Danny said. Real security. Guitar songwriting, music theory, whatever you want to teach. We need someone who has loved music through everything life did to them. We need someone who can look at a kid with a dream and believe in that dream because they know from the inside what it means to have one and what it costs to let it go. Walt looked at these 4 men, who had come from money and fame and the world to sit in his one-room apartment on a Tuesday morning in October and offer him a second chance at the thing he had loved most. "I'm 71 years old," he said. "I haven't played guitar in 25 years. I'm a janitor." Cooper leaned forward. "You're a man who built a business from nothing in a town that didn't make it easy for you, and kept it running for 23 years through sheer quality of work. You helped 4 strangers at midnight on the worst night of your life, without asking for a single thing in return. That's the only credential that matters for what we're asking you to do." Walt looked at these 4 men for a long time. "There's one more thing," Danny said. His voice shifted, something careful and deliberate entering at the tone of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say, and is still not entirely sure he has found the right words. "Walt, we found your daughter." Everything in the room stopped moving. "Ellie," Danny nodded. "She lives in Reno, Nevada. She moved there 6 years ago from Sacramento. She's a music teacher at a middle school." Walt stared at him. "She's the one who told us where to find you." Walt stood up. His legs were not entirely steady. "She contacted your management 4 years ago. She came to a concert in Sacramento, heard us play Somebody Stopped, heard the story, went home that night and wrote our management a letter, saying her father was the man we had been looking for." Walt could not find words for a moment. "She's been looking for you for 10 years, Danny said. "Your ex-wife told Ellie things that weren't accurate, made her believe you had chosen to leave, that the silence was deliberate, that you had built a new life and moved on. Ellie believed it through her teens and into her 20s, because it was what she had been told, and there was nothing available to contradict it. But she grew up. She accessed the divorce records in her late 20s for an administrative reason, and sat in a government office and read the actual file. The custody attempts were there, the legal fees, the letters from your attorney, the record of how long you had tried before running out of money. She did her own research and found a very different story than the one she had grown up with. She tried to find me," Walt said. "You moved 5 times in 20 years without leaving consistent forwarding information," Danny said. "She got close twice, but the addresses were years old by the time she had them." Danny paused carefully. "She's in the hallway right now, Walt. She wanted to give you the option to be told first. She is terrified that you might not want to see her, that the years have made the distance feel like what you preferred." Walt was at the door before Danny finished the sentence. 25 years. That's how long Walt spent believing his daughter had moved on without him. 25 years of returned letters, disconnected numbers, and silence that felt like an answer, even when it wasn't. And now she's standing just on the other side of that door, scared he won't want to see her while he's terrified she won't want to stay. "Before Walt opens that door, I want to ask you something. Is there someone in your life you've lost touch with, not because you stopped caring, but because life just got in the way, and the distance kept growing? Drop their name, or just the word yes in the comments. You don't have to explain. We'll understand. And if this story is touching your heart tonight, share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to find your way back to the people who matter." Now let's see what's waiting on the other side of that door. She was standing against the opposite wall, with her arms crossed over her chest. Not in defensiveness, but in the way people hold themselves when they are trying to keep from coming apart in a public corridor. She was in her late 30s, dark hair, with a few threads of gray at the temple, that she had not bothered to hide her mother's cheekbones, but something in the set of her jaw and the shape of her brow that was pure Walter Hayes and had always been. She was crying before he said her name. He said it anyway. "Ellie," she said, "Dad." Neither of them moved for 3 full seconds. The distance of 25 years compressed into that brief and terrible pause. And then she crossed the hallway, and Walt held his daughter for the first time since she had been 12 years old, and everything he had told himself over 25 years about being fine and being built for solitude and not needing what he didn't have turned out to be exactly what it had always been, the story you tell yourself when the truth is too heavy to carry uncovered. The 4 band members quietly slipped into the stairwell and pulled the door closed behind them, giving father and daughter the only privacy available in a studio apartment building, which is the privacy of being completely alone in a shared space. Walt and Ellie sat at his small kitchen table for nearly 4 hours. They talk the way people talk when they have too much ground to cover and know they cannot cover all of it, but are going to try anyway, because covering some of it is better than standing at the edge of it indefinitely. Ellie told him what Patricia had told her, that Walt had been relieved when the marriage ended, that he had started fresh, deliberately, that the unanswered letters and unreturned calls were Walt choosing not to engage, not Patricia intercepting them. Ellie had believed this through her teens because it was what she had been told, and her mother was the parent who had stayed, and there was no one to offer a different account. She told him, when the doubt had started. She was 28, doing paperwork for her teaching certificate, and had needed a family document that required accessing the divorce records. She had sat in a government office and read the actual file, and found a completely different story than the one she had grown up with. The custody attempts were there, the legal fees, the letters from Walt's attorney and the responses from Patricia's attorney blocking every avenue, the timeline of attempts that had gone on for years before the money ran out. It wasn't what I had been told, Ellie said. Not even close. She had tried to find him through directories and employment records, but Walt had moved 5 times in 20 years, without leaving a consistent trail, and the addresses she eventually tracked down were years old by the time she had them. She had been close in 2001 when she sent 2 letters to an address in Casper that Walt had vacated in 1999. I left Casper 2 years before those letters arrived, Walt said. I know that now. They were quiet together for a moment, 2 people accounting for all the near misses, and the timing failures and the small logistical catastrophes that had accumulated into 25 years of absence. Then Ellie reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Dad, I need you to hear something. You did fight for me. I've seen the records. I know what you spent and how many times you tried. You weren't the one who stopped, and the years we lost them because of circumstances that neither of us controlled. I understand that now. I understood it the day I read those records. She paused. And we have years ahead of us. We can't get back what we lost, but we don't have to lose any more. Walt looked at his daughter, late 30s, a whole life he had missed. The music, he said, almost to himself. You became a music teacher. Ellie was quiet for a moment before she answered. I kept music because of you, she said finally. Even when I thought you didn't want to be found, even when I believed the story I'd been given, I kept music because it was the one thing I knew you had loved before everything fell apart. I wanted to stay connected to that, to the version of you that existed before the story made you into someone unrecognizable. Walt held that for a long time. He thought about an old acoustic guitar hanging on a wall for 23 years. He thought about a cassette tape in a shoebox under a bed. He thought about the way love persists in the things we keep, even when we cannot explain why we keep them. He thought about kindness, and the directions it travels and how it rarely travels in straight lines. She also told him about her life. Married 9 years to a man named Steve, an electrician from Reno, who was steady and genuinely funny in a slow-building way that you couldn't imagine not having once you had it. 2 children. A boy named Ryan, who was 7 years old and currently devoted to baseball, and reluctantly curious about guitar because his mother had suggested it was worth trying. A girl named June, who was 4 years old and afraid of nothing, and had opinions about everything, and delivered them without hesitation or apology. Walt had grandchildren he had never met. He had grandchildren who did not know his face. I'd like to teach them guitar, Walt said, not quite meaning to say it out loud, just the thought arriving as words. Ellie smiled slowly, the smile working its way through the tears. Yeah, she said, I think that's exactly right. I think that's... The band took Walt and Ellie to dinner that night at a restaurant in downtown Billings, where the menu had no prices printed on it, which Walt understood to mean the prices were high enough that the type of person expected to dine there was not the type who needed to ask. They stayed at the table for 3 hours. They told stories and laughed genuinely rather than politely, and made plans that felt real rather than the kind of plans people make over expensive dinners when they mean to be kind but don't actually intend to follow through. The music school position was real. Danny had a folder with him, an actual folder with a contract inside it, and he slid it across the table to Walt after the main course. Salary, benefits, job description, start date flexible, based on Walt's needs. The school was called the Highway School of Music, named after the song, named after the night on the highway in Nebraska. It currently served more than 300 students a year from families who could not afford private instruction. Walt looked at the contract for a long time without opening it. I haven't played in 25 years, he said again. My hands are a janitor's hands now, Cooper said. We know, and we have a plan for that. You start in January. Between now and then, you spend every day with a guitar in your hands. You're not learning anything new. You're remembering what's already there. The muscle memory of a man who played seriously for years doesn't fully disappear. It waits. It's not performing, Tommy added. It's teaching. You're going to sit with kids in a room and help them find what music means to them. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be present. You need to be someone who has loved music through everything life did to them and kept that love, even when the instrument was in a shoebox under the bed. Ellie reached over and opened the folder. Walt read the contract. He signed it. After dinner, when Ellie had gone back to her hotel, with plans to fly home to Reno the next morning and begin arranging a visit with Steve and the children, the 4 band members stayed another hour with Walt at the table, drinking coffee and talking about music the way musicians talk about it when they are not being interviewed, the real conversation, rather than the public one. Garrett said something that surprised Walt delivered quietly, near the end of the evening with the unhurried directness of a man who chooses his words carefully, because he means each one. You know, after that night in your garage, I spent years thinking about that guitar on the wall, the one you hadn't played in 23 years. It changed the way I thought about what we were doing and why we were doing it. Whenever I wanted to quit, whenever the touring got hard, or the industry felt impossible, I thought about that guitar on the wall, and I thought about what it would mean to walk away from it, and I kept going. Walt looked at him. You never said a word that night. No, Garrett said simply, but I heard everything. Walt thought about the quiet young man in the corner of his garage, the serious eyes that had watched everything and said almost nothing, accumulating, understanding the way still water accumulates depth. He thought about how kindness travels in directions you cannot see and arrives at destinations you cannot anticipate. Before they all left, Danny said something Walt returned to many times in the years that followed. We almost didn't come tonight, not because we didn't want to find you, but because we were afraid. Afraid that after 25 years you might have built a life where our arriving would feel like an intrusion. Afraid you'd be fine, and our showing up would be us, needing something from you, needing the story to close properly for our sake, rather than yours. He paused. But we owed you more than our own comfort. We owed you the knowledge that what you did that night is still mattering. Every person who has ever heard that song has heard about a man who stopped on a dark highway because it was the right thing to do. Walt, there are people all over this country who heard that story and made a different choice in their own lives because of it. You created a ripple that you never got to see. We wanted you to finally see it. Walt was quiet for a moment. I just fixed a van, he said. Danny replied. You gave us our future. Those two things are the same. Walt moved to Los Angeles in March of 2009. He rented a 1-bedroom apartment near the Highway School of Music, a meaningful upgrade from the studio in Billings. He bought a used acoustic guitar at a shop in Pasadena on his 3rd day in the city. Nothing expensive, just a good instrument with a clean sound and a neck that fit his grip. He spent the first 2 weeks simply holding it, while he sat on the small balcony in the evenings, letting his hands remember the weight and shape of it, reintroducing himself to something he had put down so long ago that picking it back up felt strange, in a way that was also deeply familiar. Then he started playing. The muscle memory was there, rougher at first. Then he anticipated the fingering, slower. The calluses, long gone, so that his fingertips ached for the first 3 weeks, in a way that made him wonder if he had miscalculated his own capacity. But the knowledge was there. The chord shapes and the transitions and the rhythm and the understanding of how a song is built that you cannot fully unlearn once you have learned it deeply enough. It came back, not all at once, but in stages. The way a language comes back when you find someone you haven't spoken to in years and realize the words between you were always still there. He started teaching in April. His first class was 7 students between the ages of 11 and 15. A boy named Jordan, who had taught himself 3 chords from a library book and wanted to learn the rest. A girl named Priya, who could read sheet music from 2 years of piano and wanted to move to guitar because she wanted to write her own songs and felt the piano was someone else's instrument. And a quiet 14-year-old named Darius, who said almost nothing in the first 3 sessions, and then one afternoon played something he had composed entirely on his own that made Walt set down his own guitar and simply listen the way you listen when you know you are hearing something real. Walt told them his story in the first week, not the famous part, not the band or the song or the check, the earlier part. Being 23 years old in Omaha with a soul and R&B band that could really play, and putting down the guitar because life required it. The 25 years of wondering. One cold November night in Nebraska, when he had made a choice to help rather than drive past, and what that choice had eventually returned to him in a hallway on a Tuesday morning in October. He told it not for inspiration, but because it was true, and because it was relevant, and because these kids needed to understand that the work they were doing in this room mattered, that the love they had for music was worth protecting, that the decision to put it down was one they could make, but should make deliberately, and not because the world told them they couldn't. I used to play soul and R&B, he told them, music that came from a specific history and meant something beyond just the notes. I know what it costs to love music when the world gives you reasons not to, and I know what it costs to set it down. Don't set it down unless you absolutely have to, and even then know that it will wait for you. The music always waits. It's never too late, he told them regularly. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like something adults say to make young people feel better, but I am telling you from inside a 72-year-old body that it is literally and completely true. Sometimes the dream just takes the long way around. He saw Ellie every 6 weeks. She and Steve and the children drove up from Reno, or Walt took the train down, and they accumulated the ordinary accumulation of family time that Walt had not had in 25 years' dinners and weekend outings, and the specific pleasure of watching children become gradually more comfortable with a person as that person becomes gradually more familiar. Ryan was 7 when Walt first taught him guitar. The boy had his mother's patience and his father's stubbornness and a left-handed playing style that required some adjustment to how Walt had always taught, which turned out to be a useful lesson for Walt in the value of flexibility. Ryan's first chord was a G major, and he got it clean on the 4th try, and looked up at Walt with an expression of absolute satisfaction that Walt recognized as the same feeling he had had at 12 years old in his father's living room in Omaha, playing his first clean chord on a borrowed guitar. June was 4 and had no interest in the guitar, but had extensive opinions about every song Walt played and was willing to share them in considerable detail and without hesitation. Her primary critical criterion appeared to be whether a song made her want to move, and songs that did not make her want to move were assessed as needing improvement, regardless of their technical merit. Walt found her an invaluable audience. He called Roy every Sunday evening. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing much about the weather and the news, and Roy's grandchildren, and Walt's students, and occasionally about that night in November of 1983, when Roy had driven 4 strangers from Nebraska to Chicago in the dark and the snow, and arrived 13 minutes early to a meeting that changed 5 lives. "You know what the funniest part is," Roy said once. "I complained the entire 6-hour drive, nonstop, and those 4 kids just sat there and said yes, sir, and thank you, sir, the whole way." Walt laughed. "They were scared to death. They had real good manners about it," Roy said. The band came to Los Angeles twice a year for highway school fundraisers and events, and Walt came to everyone. He and Danny had the easy shorthand of 2 people who share something significant and have found each other on the other side of it, their conversation always picking up from wherever it left off, without the need for recapping or reestablishing. Danny told him at one point that Garrett had quietly left the band in 2005 to start a music education program in Denver for at-risk youth, which Walt had not known, and which struck him as exactly right when he heard it. The quiet young man who had sat in the corner of his garage watching everything had spent 20 years in rock and roll, and then followed something quieter and more essential, the way still water eventually finds the place it is meant to fill. It was the ripple, Walt thought. Danny had been right about the ripple. It did not travel in straight lines, and it did not stop where you could see it stop. In the fall of 2011, on a Wednesday afternoon, when Walt was eating lunch in the break room at the Highway School of Music, Danny called him. "Walt, are you sitting down? I'm eating a sandwich. Sit down anyway. We're going into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Induction ceremony is in March in Cleveland. And Walt, before you say anything, before you tell us you don't need to be there, or that it's our night and not yours, I need you to know that we have already decided you are coming. This is not a request. This is a notification." Walt opened his mouth. "Non-negotiable," Danny said. Walt closed his mouth. He flew to Cleveland with Ellie and Steve and both of the children, Ryan now 10 years old, and considerably more interested in the ceremony once he understood the scale of it, and June, now 7, and interested in everything always and specifically, interested in the hotel swimming pool, which they visited immediately upon arrival. Then they dressed for the ceremony, and Walt wore the suit Ellie had helped him buy in Reno 2 years earlier, and Steve told him he looked distinguished, which Walt took, in the spirit intended. The ceremony was held in a large ballroom, attended by people who had dedicated their lives to rock and roll, in one capacity or another, musicians and producers and journalists, and the sort of elegantly dressed attendees who appear at events that have been on magazine covers for decades. Walt sat at a table with Ellie and Steve and the children, and watched the evening unfold, each inductee presenting their credentials through music and carefully crafted acceptance speeches. And then it was the band's turn. The four of them took the stage to a standing ovation that went on long enough to become almost overwhelming. They accepted it with the easy humor of men who have spent decades learning to receive attention without being defined by it. Danny stepped to the podium. He did not begin with thank yous. He began with a highway. 28 years ago, in November of 1983, our van broke down on a 2-lane highway in Nebraska. The ballroom went quiet. Danny told the whole story. He told it slowly and carefully, and with the attention to detail of a man who has told the same story hundreds of times, and still feels every word of it the same way each time. The fuel pump and the radiator, the $32, the 8 o'clock meeting, the mechanic who had come out at midnight from a garage he was losing, who had worked through the night, who had called his brother, who had refused every attempt at payment, a black man who had built his business against considerable odds in a small Nebraska town, and who, on the last night before losing everything he had built, had stopped for 4 strangers because it was the right thing to do. He told it the way he told it from every stage, because it was not just a story about a band and some mechanic. It was a story about what kindness looks like when it costs something, and about what happens when one person decides to stop. "The man's name is Walter Hayes," Danny said. "He is sitting in this room tonight. He is a guitar teacher at a school we founded in Los Angeles that serves kids who otherwise would not have access to music instruction. He is a father and a grandfather, and a man who spent 25 years thinking he didn't matter. We have been trying to correct that impression for some time. Tonight, we would like to ask him to come up here." Walt had known this was coming, and had still not fully prepared for it. Ellie squeezed his hand. Ryan looked up at his grandfather with the wide eyes of a 10-year-old suddenly recalibrating his understanding of who exactly he had been sitting next to on the airplane. June leaned over and whispered with complete satisfaction, "Grandpa Walt, that's you." Walt stood up. He walked to the stage. The room rose. Not politely, not as a formality, but genuinely the way rooms rise when they understand that something is happening that is worth standing for. Walt climbed the steps and took Danny's hand and felt the weight of the microphone pressed into his other hand, and looked out at 2,500 people standing in a ballroom in Cleveland, Ohio, and had the sudden, complete, disorienting understanding that this was real, that this was actually happening to him, to Walter Hayes of Harlow Creek, Nebraska, who had mopped floors and eaten grocery store sandwiches and kept a cassette tape in a shoebox under his bed for 25 years. He had not prepared a speech. He said, "I didn't do anything special. I just stopped." The room cheered. He said, "I stopped because I saw myself in 4 young men who were out of time and out of options, and I knew from the inside what it felt like to want something that badly, and I couldn't drive past that." That's all it was. One person seeing another person and not looking away. He paused. He looked at Ryan and June in the audience, his grandchildren who were watching their grandfather from a table in a ballroom in Cleveland. with expressions he wanted to hold in his memory for the rest of his life. "I want every young person in this room to know something," he said. "Every good thing you do matters more than you think it does, and lasts longer than you will ever know." I went 25 years thinking that one night had dissolved into nothing. These four men spent those same 25 years proving me wrong at every concert they played. You don't get to decide how much your kindness matters. You only get to decide whether you stop. Danny stepped to his own microphone. "You stopped when everyone else kept driving." Walt looked at him. "I saw myself in you. I wanted you to have the shot I didn't take. And now you have yours too," Danny said. "That's how it works when kindness is real. It comes back." The band gave Walt a plaque before the evening was over. He had asked them not to. They had listened attentively and done it anyway. It was a platinum record, their biggest single, mounted in a frame, with an engraving at the bottom that read, "Walter Hayes. This song exists because of you. You stopped. Everything else followed." Walt held it on the flight home. He would not put it in the overhead bin. He held it in his lap for 4 hours, while Ellie slept in the seat beside him, and Steve and the children slept across the aisle. Ryan, with his headphones on, and June curled against her father's arm, and Cleveland fell away behind them in the dark. He thought about November of 1983. The cold and the snow and the hazard lights blinking orange on the highway, and the sound of a guitar coming from somewhere down the road. The keys in his hand and the thought, "Not your problem," and the moment, just before he turned away, when something in him had refused. He thought about the first time he had tried to borrow money for his garage and been turned away without explanation, and about Roy co-signing the second application, and about 5 years of proving to a town that hadn't expected him to last that he was worth their business. He thought about the 23 years of running Hayes Auto, and the 25 years of mopping floors, and the cassette tape in the shoebox, and the Tuesday morning when 4 men had knocked on his door. He thought about Ellie saying, "I kept music because of you, even when I thought you were gone." He thought about Ryan's clean G major chord, and June's running critical commentary on every song he played, and Roy's voice on the phone every Sunday evening, and Garrett's quiet eyes in the corner of a garage, understanding something about a guitar on a wall that had never been said out loud, and then 22 years later, going to Denver to teach music to kids who needed someone to stop for them. The ripple. It does not travel in straight lines. It does not stop where you can see it stop. The platinum record caught the cabin light. Walter Hayes was 75 years old. He had been a musician and a mechanic and a construction worker and a janitor and now a guitar teacher, and all of it had been the same life traveling toward the same place by the longest possible route. He had stopped on a dark highway once because he could not make himself drive past someone who needed help. That was all it had taken. One decision on one cold night in Nebraska to be the kind of man who stops. He looked out the window at the dark above the clouds, clear and deep and without limit, and for the first time in a very long time, Walter Hayes did not think about what he had lost or what he had missed or the years that had gone the way they went. He thought about what was ahead, the school, Ryan's guitar lessons, June's opinions about every song, Sunday calls with Roy, students like Darius who played something real when they thought no one was listening. He had thought his story ended in a garage in Nebraska in 1983. It turned out it had started there, and the best of it was still being written. Walter Hayes didn't change the world that night. He just stopped when it would have been easier to drive past. One small decision on a cold, dark highway, and somehow it found its way back to him 25 years later, in the form of a knock on the door, a daughter in the hallway, and a guitar in his hands again. Maybe kindness was never meant to be a grand gesture. Maybe it's just the moment you choose to stop for a stranger, for someone struggling, for the version of yourself you see in another person's eyes. If this story moved you, please like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that what they do matters. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. And tell us in the comments, have you ever stopped for someone when it would have been easier to keep going? We'd love to hear your story.